Welcome to Water Level. The story of Lake Powell and Lake Mead is really a story told in numbers, in elevations, in inflows and outflows, and in the delicate balance of water that moves through the Colorado River system. Today, as we step into October of 2025, both reservoirs continue to sit well below their full capacities. These are the two largest reservoirs in the United States, and their water levels matter not only for those who live nearby, but for tens of millions of people who rely on their storage, their power, and their regulation of the river. Let's begin with Lake Powell. The latest recorded elevation on September 30th, 2025, places the lake at 3,544.69 feet above sea level. To put that number into perspective, full pool for Powell is 3,700 feet. That means the lake is sitting about 155 feet below where it would be if it were completely full. By percentage, that equates to about 27.75% of storage capacity. Powell was designed to hold more than 24 million acre-feet of water, but right now it is holding just over 6.7 million acre-feet. For a system that depends on every drop, that is a thin margin. What stands out even more than the current elevation is the comparison to 1 year ago. Lake Powell is down more than 33 feet from the same date in 2024. Imagine a drop that significant in just 12 months. Over the past year, Powell's waterline has fallen steadily, month after month, with only a brief pause during the late spring snowmelt. The chart for the past 12 months shows exactly that. A gradual slope downward through fall and winter, a weak plateau in May and June, and then another steady decline through summer into early fall. The trajectory is unmistakably downward. Part of the reason lies in the balance between what's coming in and what's going out. For water year 2025, total inflows to Lake Powell were measured at 5.1 million acre-feet. Normally, by September, inflows average more than 10.2 million acre-feet, which means this year's supply was only about half of what's typical. Outflows, on the other hand, reached 7.48 million acre-feet. That's just under the minimum release requirement of 7.5 million acre-feet through Glen Canyon Dam. In simple terms, Powell released far more than it received, and the deficit amounted to a net loss of more than 2.3 million acre-feet in storage. That's why the lake sits where it does today, lower than last year and far below its full pool. Another way to think about it is in depth. At Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Powell is currently about 412 feet deep. That depth still allows the reservoir to operate, but as the elevation falls, higher intakes for hydropower and water delivery become less usable, and pressure at the dam decreases. This means power generation becomes less efficient. Every foot of elevation lost reduces the ability of Powell to generate the same amount of electricity from the same amount of water. So while the reservoir is far from empty, it is running at diminished capability. Looking at the chart in detail, we can follow Powell's path over the last 12 months. In October 2024, the reservoir was sitting close to 3,578 feet. By December, it had already slipped into the 3,570-foot range. Winter brought further declines, and by March 2025, Powell hovered in the 3,560s. Normally, spring melt would deliver a surge, but this year, the rise was small, bringing only a brief bump in late spring and June. From there, the decline resumed. July, August, and September each brought more losses, with the elevation dropping below 3,550 feet by mid-September and sliding into the mid-3,540s by the end of the month. Today's number, 3,544.69 feet, is a stark reminder of how much the reservoir has fallen. Now, let's shift downstream to Lake Mead. On October 1st, 2025, the elevation of Lake Mead was measured at 1,057.40 feet above sea level. Full pool for Mead is 1,229 feet, which means the reservoir is sitting more than 171 feet below capacity. In terms of percentages, Mead is storing just under 35% of its full capacity, which mirrors Powell's diminished storage. This is not just a number on a page. It represents hundreds of feet of lost elevation along the canyon walls and a massive reduction in the water available to supply cities, farms, and industries across the Southwest. The graph for Lake Mead reveals a pattern that, while different in shape from Powell's, tells the same kind of story. In early 2025, Mead was sitting near 1063. By March, it had climbed to just above 1070, marking its seasonal peak. That rise came from spring inflows and coordinated releases upstream. But from that point forward, the reservoir began a steep decline. By mid-July, Mead had fallen to around 1055 feet, its lowest point of the year. Since then, the reservoir has gained back a couple of feet, climbing into the 1057-foot range where it sits today. When compared with 2024, Mead's elevation is consistently lower. Last year, it peaked higher, near 1077 feet, before dropping. This year's peak was lower, and the summer decline was sharper. That difference may not sound dramatic at first glance, but in reservoirs of this size, a few feet can represent hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water. It's the difference between stable operation and the risk of shortages. Another angle of analysis is the relationship between Powell and Mead. Because Powell feeds Mead through its releases, the two lakes are linked. This year, Powell released about 7.48 million acre-feet, nearly the minimum requirement. Those releases helped Mead gain a bit of ground in late summer. That small rise is visible on the Mead chart from August into September. But because Powell itself was already running a deficit, the benefit to Mead was limited. In short, Mead can't rise if Powell is falling, and Powell cannot recover if inflows are weak. It's a chain reaction, and right now, both links in the chain are under stress. Let's take a closer look at seasonal behavior. For Powell, the reservoir's low point usually comes at the end of winter before the spring melt. But this year, the spring melt was too weak to make a difference. For Mead, the seasonal high usually comes in spring or early summer before heavy downstream demand begins to draw it down. In 2025, both reservoirs peaked lower and declined faster than they did in 2024. That's a troubling sign, because it shows not only that storage is low, but also that the seasonal cycle is delivering smaller gains and sharper losses. Another layer of analysis comes from the tributary reservoirs. The 34 upstream reservoirs feeding Powell are currently at about 68.5% capacity. That is healthier than Powell itself, but not nearly strong enough to offset Powell's deficit. Meanwhile, rivers feeding into Powell are running at only 76% of the average for early October. These inflow numbers matter because they set the stage for the coming months. If flows remain weak, Powell will continue to decline, and Mead will receive less water as a result. It's also useful to remember historical benchmarks. Powell reached its all-time low in 2022 at about 3522 feet. Today, at 3544 feet, it is not far above that record. Mead's record low, also in 2022, was just above 1140 feet. With today's level of 1057 feet, it too is only about 17 feet above that historical bottom. These lakes have been lower, but not by much, and the current numbers show that both are operating uncomfortably close to their all-time lows. What does this mean in practical terms? For Lake Powell, every foot of elevation matters for hydro generation at Glen Canyon Dam. The deeper the water, the more pressure on the turbines, and the more power can be produced. As the elevation drops, efficiency falls. At Lake Mead, the same principle applies at Hoover Dam. Lower elevations reduce hydropower output, meaning less electricity is generated for the same release of water. So while the reservoir is far from empty, it is running at diminished capability. Looking at the long-term picture is also important. Over the past decade, Powell has lost more than 100 feet of elevation, and Mead has lost more than 130 feet. In that time, there have been small rebounds, short periods when the lakes gained a few feet, but the dominant trend is downward. As we step into the new water year of 2026, the numbers we've seen so far paint a cautious picture. Lake Powell is at 3544 feet, down 33 feet from a year ago, with inflows only half of average and outflows nearly meeting their full requirement. Lake Mead is at 1057 feet, down from last year and still more than 170 feet below full pool. Both reservoirs are storing barely a third of their designed capacity. The data is consistent, the charts are clear, and the analysis leaves little doubt these are reservoirs under strain. In closing, here is the takeaway. Lake Powell has fallen more than 33 feet in the past year and is holding less than 28% of its full capacity. Lake Mead is at 1057 feet, more than 170 feet below full pool, storing only about a third of what it was designed to hold. Their charts from the past year show downward slopes with only brief, shallow rebounds. Both lakes are linked, both lakes are struggling, and both lakes remain far below healthy operating levels.